Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and if you're hearing my voice a little bit lower in register than normal, it's just because I've had a really, really bad cough and cold this last week. But I'm on the mend now, so voice is back. This is actually the first call I've taken this week. The first couple of days of this week, I haven't had any calls. I cancelled everything because I was not feeling too great. But back on the mend now, so here we are today, back. And with me on the show today, I have my special guest, John. John, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I'm John Atkinson. I'm the Chief Product Officer at LiveEO. We are a geospatial company based in Berlin, and today we're going to be talking about a sustainability product that we've built for EUDR compliance.
Nice. Okay. And John, I've had your CEO Sven on the podcast last year, and we talked a little bit about LiveEO. We talked a little bit about its genesis, and we talked a little bit about its recent pivot. So I'm gonna say that maybe 10% of the people listening today might have heard that episode, given it's a year ago. Might be a little more, might be a little less. But for people who haven't, and even for people who have, could you give us a little refresher on kind of the genesis of LiveEO, where you started out and what you're up to now?
Sure. LiveEO was founded to monitor infrastructure at scale. So think long linear infrastructure like railroads. Deutsche Bahn is one of our customers. We also monitor power grids throughout Europe, Asia, Australia, and the United States. Anything that's long that you can use Earth observation to monitor, that's where we got our start. And the problem that we were trying to solve was understanding the vegetation risk to that linear infrastructure. Well, whether it was grow-in risk or fall-in risk on a power line or fall-in risk on a rail line, it was important for our customers to understand where they needed to go or send their crews to go and cut trees, trim back trees, things like that to make sure that their grids weren't compromised or rail traffic wasn't interrupted.
Just to clarify, John, when you say Earth observation data, you're talking satellite photography information, right?
We are talking satellites. Yeah. We leverage some of the free sources, the Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-1 for some of our SAR data, but we also use Airbus and Planet for commercial data.
Okay. And you've gone beyond just doing the power lines and the railway lines now. So again, Sven mentioned this last time, but for people who didn't catch that, talk to me a little bit about, the pivot.
Yeah, so it's not really a pivot. We have three product lines or three product families. We have the tree line product, which is for monitoring vegetative growth for linear infrastructure such as rail and power lines. We have Surface Scout, and Surface Scout monitors pipelines and monitors their right-of-way for any third-party interference or incursion into it. And then when we sat down last year and thought about where we could go next, what was the market that we really wanted to go after, where we could leverage a lot of the experience that we gathered with the previous products, the EUDR regulation came right up to the top. Just to give you a little context, when you're monitoring vegetation, it's very similar to monitoring deforestation. We're basically looking for where trees are now, where they weren't,
right?
Which is the inverse of what we're looking for in deforestation. The way that we did that was through training machine learning models to identify the undergrowth or the growth that was affecting the right-of-way. And so using that background of machine learning and identifying vegetation and species and vitality with ML, we thought, wouldn't it be a better solution to do that with deforestation so we could accurately identify where deforestation did occur that would be in violation of the regulation, but more importantly, as we're seeing these days, where deforestation didn't occur, but some of the open source maps, we call it open source data, but it's just the freely available deforestation or forest cover maps, where we see those failing. We thought that we might be able to do a better job with the analytics and really make sure that if the plot is compliant, that those goods could be imported into the EU.
Okay. And again, just for people who might be unaware, can you give us a quick 101 on the EUDR?
Sure. So the EUDR is the European Union Deforestation Regulation. And what it basically says is that you can't import any goods into the European Union that are a product of deforestation after January 1st of 2020. So there is a line in the sand that was drawn. If a plot or a parcel was deforested before January 1st, 2020, you can ship those goods in. If it was deforested afterward, those goods are no longer allowed to be brought into the European Union. And as you can imagine, that has the potential to wreak havoc on a supply chain.
Yeah.
Just going through the process of making sure that you're compliant is a new thing for the industry.
And it's certain categories of goods. It's not everything, correct?
Right. It's 7 commodities
for now.
The big ones that we look at are palm, rubber, coffee, but it's also cocoa, timber,
meat,
cattle, soy. So those are the 7. But the deforestation issues are really acute when you're dealing with palm, rubber, and cocoa and coffee.
Okay. And so what you guys are doing is you're looking at areas. Now, how do you go back to January 2020?
That's one of the very convenient things of when you're using the free data set from Sentinel-2, they've been capturing imagery for years. So they capture every piece of the planet every 14 days or so.
Right.
So we've got the data to show whether deforestation occurred or not. And our machine learning models, they don't need a lot of data to come up with a decision on whether it happened or not. So, we're using data from, prior to the cutoff date to understand whether deforestation existed. But then we also look forward to see if any new deforestation occurred. Because again, if a plot is outlined, but new deforestation happened within it at any point, it automatically becomes non-compliant.
Okay. And if I am non-compliant, what are the implications?
Well, as a good corporate citizen, you shouldn't be importing your goods. The enforcement mechanism is that the fines can be as high as 4% of your turnover. And if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, and that's who would be paying. It's the company that is bringing the good in or importing the good into the European Union for market. That's the company that would be subject to the fine.
So it's only companies...
It's similar to GDPR.
Yep, but it's only companies operating in the EU then?
Correct. It's only goods that are being brought into the EU. Though there are other efforts around the world to replicate that. And I'm from California, even though I live in Berlin now. I'm originally from California, and I fully expect at some point California will have a similar regulation to EUDR for goods being brought into California.
Okay, and are companies, well, let's talk about when this legislation is coming into force, because if I remember correctly from discussions with Sven last year, it's the end of this year, start of 2025 that this starts to take effect. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. On January 1st of next year, large companies have to be compliant. The small and micro businesses, they can, I think it's 6 months after, they have to be compliant. But they're really focused on getting the big ones compliant before the end of this year, so that that represents the biggest chunk of all of the imports. So,
okay,
that'll have the biggest impact.
And I assume, like all previous big legislations, like this GDPR, as you referenced earlier, I assume all the big companies are completely prepared for this.
Oh yeah. No, they're completely prepared. It's funny. There's been a lot of stuff happening in the news, reports about the asking for delays and pushing back on this legislation. I think it's actually going to happen. They may do a grace period on the fines for a bit, but there is a lot of momentum with large companies getting themselves ready. And if they delay this, I think someone's asking for one interest group was asking for an additional 2 years. That's just going to suck momentum out of the efforts that are already in place. And it's funny. One of the complaints, I think it was the head of the Indonesian palm industry interest group. They complained that the open source data wasn't accurate, and we know that it's not accurate, and they know that it's not accurate. But you don't have to use the open source data. There's other ways and other approaches to get accurate readings, so you can make sure those goods are compliant. And I understand the pain, right? If there are companies out out there that are selling EUDR solutions that are 100% reliant on that freely available data. And their customers, when they finally do the analysis, their customers are going to be in for an awakening. We've done comparisons internally, and I can get into like how we do it for EUDR specifically, but we did identify in one case open source data from a very reputable agency or third party NGO, very reputable. We looked at 500, I think it was 540 plots,
Mm-hmm.
and they had 320 false positives out of 540.
So in 320 out of 500, they were saying that there had been deforestation where there actually hadn't?
They were saying there was deforestation where there actually hadn't. The actual number was 74. So there is a valid concern with the data, but the flip side of that is there's also ways to get better data. And if companies need to spend some money to do that, or other entities need to spend money to get that data, then it's worth it, because what we're trying to do is it's bigger from a sustainability standpoint. It's bigger than any company that's importing chocolate or importing coffee into the EU.
Sure. No, I understand that. So if I am a company who has had a false positive flagged for my either stuff that I wanted to bring in, or if I'm a producer outside the EU whose plot of land has been false positive flagged, what redress do I have?
You can go and do a manual process or basically a due diligence process to verify that it was deforested in a different way or in a different mechanism. In some cases, they'll have people go out and look at the fields. They'll look at paperwork to make sure that it was a palm plantation before. And there are ways to get around the satellite imagery part of it. But when you're dealing with supply chains as complicated as rubber, that you can have hundreds of thousands to millions of suppliers when you calculate in all of the smallholders.
Mm-hmm.
Doing that level of work it's just going to be prohibitively hard to do manually. So getting the data right the first time, and using models that can be demonstrated as accurate. And if anybody at the EU wants to take the time, when goods are coming in, if they want to take the time to do their own due diligence and verify the results, they can. We stand behind them. They're extremely accurate results. So, there are ways to do it, but we've talked to customers. We talked to actually one interest group in particular, and their entire strategy was to hire lobbyists to get this pushed down the road.
No doubt. I mean, I could see how this would be massively disruptive to supply chains, seeing as we're on the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast. If I'm bringing in rubber, let's say I'm a tire manufacturer and I'm bringing in rubber from, I don't know, Southeast Asia, and suddenly a huge number of my suppliers are deemed as causing deforestation where I know, or I'm told they haven't, suddenly I'd lose access to those suppliers, or is there a way around that?
That's where you can go and do the sort of manual due diligence on every parcel to check it. Yeah, there are ways around it, but it is not automated and it is not pretty. Yeah, it's painful.
And in the LiveEO case, though, you can say, actually, no, that false positive is a false positive. So
we can point the finger right back at the open source data and say, this is what the open source data says, and this is why it's wrong. Right? Because you can kind of, in some cases, you can see that the data wasn't georeferenced correctly. I remember looking at one map, and it showed a parcel that was legally available for a palm plantation in the ocean. Right? they just missed the georeferencing, so it wasn't aligned with the area that they were looking at. But in most cases, we can share our results, and we do share our results with the due diligence statement, so they can be reviewed by the EU.
Right.
And again, we're very confident in the results, and we spot check these, with higher resolution satellite imagery manually, just to make sure that the quality is where it needs to be.
Sure. Yeah. No. And if suppliers are wrongfully excluded, could this lead to some kind of blacklist effect where good suppliers are penalized based on faulty data? And, how does that ripple through supply chains?
That's the big risk, right? So the easiest way to make sure the goods are compliant is to make sure you're buying from suppliers that have compliant plots or compliant parcels. But if you're a compliant supplier and you're obeying the rules, that is unfairly removing you from the supply chain. And when you think, again, going back to the smallholders, when you pull them out of the equation, that's someone's livelihood, right? And if they're working land that has been deforested, in a way that is compliant with the legislation, they deserve a premium, right, for that, for those goods. And instead, they're getting disqualified entirely. And what's going to happen is if things go forward with the second tier data, the open source data, if things go forward with that, you're going to have a massive surplus of rubber that can be shipped into everywhere else but the EU. So those prices are going to drop, which means that smallholder who is unfairly disqualified, not only are they not going to be able to sell it at a premium, they're going to sell it at a lower price because the supply of non-compliant goods has increased.
Ouch.
And these are families, right?
Yeah.
And there's millions of them across those 7 commodities that would all be punished by using this type of data and not taking the time to do a proper analysis. It is, I will say this, it's a hard problem to solve.
Right.
When they're coming up with a global forest coverage map, they're trying to solve for the entire planet. What we learned is you can't do that. The models really don't work in that way. The planet's too diverse. So we break the models down by region so that we get them to that point where they're as accurate as they can be. Right? So we know that if we're looking over Southeast Asia, we have a 93 or 97% accuracy. But that same model, if we used it over Brazil, would be horribly inaccurate, which is why we train in a different way for Brazil and a different way for Sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. Okay. And you referenced as well that some of the plots were, in the wrong place, for want of a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
How often does that happen? And, how can companies make sure that their plots are where they're supposed to be, or they're correctly georeferenced?
Yeah. So that's something that is extremely tough to do. And fortunately, the plots themselves, those usually come across as pretty accurate because the suppliers can either draw, inside of the TradeAware platform, which is our solution for EUDR, inside of TradeAware, they can draw the parcels, they can update or upload the GeoJSON, and then they're seeing it right there on the map to make sure that it's valid and it's in the spot where it's supposed to be. The issue is when you're dealing with data that's coming from, maybe it's coming from a government organization in Indonesia or in Malaysia, and when you're putting it on top of a different map, those two might not align, right? So they may not have the same georeferencing, in which case things can sort of shift. And that's the bigger issue. But the way that our approach works, we basically bypass that risk by sticking with the Sentinel base map and the parcel drawn on top or uploaded in bulk on top.
Okay. And, for companies who are working to comply with EUDR, what does the total cost of ownership look like? Are there hidden costs and that companies might overlook in their compliance strategies?
The biggest hidden cost is the shrinking supply chain. Right? It's funny that the way they see this problem, they see it through the same prism as a lot of their sustainability goals. But the difference between a sustainability goal that you set for yourself as a corporation and a sustainability requirement enforced by law, you don't have to be 100% accurate for your corporate, ESG reporting. But you do need to be 100% compliant to bring the goods into the EU. So the problem's different. And the procurement teams that we're talking to, in a lot of cases, they have zero visibility into the effects this will have on the supply chain. They're trying to get the cheapest solution that they can in the door, right? That's their job. It's what procurement does, which means, they kind of have to cast a blind eye toward the issue with the data. And they're not familiar with it anyway. It's not something that they deal with on a daily basis. They're not running the business. They're not affected personally if the supply chain shrinks. They're just procuring a solution to make sure the data, the goods are compliant. The paperwork is done.
Yeah.
And that's actually, we see a lot of the focus being on the paperwork side. And for months, customers didn't want to talk about the data. But now that a lot of companies have implemented a solution based on a competitive offering that has the open source layers or open source data, they're seeing the problem.
Mm.
So they're coming back and re-engaging with us around this conversation of, how can we use, your ML to ensure that our supply chain is as complete as possible.
Interesting. Given how complex all of this is and it's becoming, it feels like we're in kind of a Mission Impossible movie. What's the toughest mission LiveEO has had to take on, and how did you navigate it?
I think there were the toughest one for us to date has really been getting customers to understand the value of precision analytics, right? And making sure that they can see the pain that's coming. It was hard for us to quantify that until we started seeing results come back from our now customers that we're trying to solve the problem with the freely available data.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when a rubber supplier to large tire manufacturers sees 70% of their supply chain evaporate, that raises a flag, right? So
Yeah.
the business now starts to care about that, which, by the way, is where sustainability needs to be. It needs to be thought of as part of the business, not thought of as something procurement can handle internally and manage through an ESG team. It really does, to have a truly sustainable supply chain, it does have to be part of that business.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting the attention of the people that actually run that core business, the rubber supply business. So when they're getting engaged, we start to see that traction. The other problem and it's not necessarily a LiveEO trade-aware problem, it's a customer problem, is getting all of the suppliers onto a platform, or understanding what the plots look like.
Yeah.
If you've got a million suppliers in your supply chain, how are you going to collect all of that data? Because we've talked to teams where they have two people sitting in an office, or in a war room in a conference room, trying to get all of this data from their suppliers, and their suppliers don't really want to give it up because it is a bit of a trade secret, right? Where are they getting it? That's a little they want to keep that a little bit private. So that led us to create a second sort of differentiator for TradeAware. Again, we were focused on the business problems. We weren't focused on the compliance paperwork at first, right? The compliance paperwork, we see that as something that, that is a straight information system, not overly complicated to do. But there was a complicated problem around how you get suppliers in. And so we created are you familiar with a commercial or social graphs?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, what social networks are built on. We built our own commercial graph into TradeAware. So you can start so buyers can invite suppliers can invite their sub-suppliers, and so on and so on. And all of that data is anonymized until it gets to that tier one supplier. And the tier one supplier can provide all of the data without exposing their supply chain to their customer. So there's no risk that the customer is going to go around them, to buy the goods. Right. So, but what that does is, instead of having two people in a conference room in a war room trying to do this, you can now have hundreds or thousands of suppliers adding their own parcels as they need to, either uploading it or just drawing it inside the TradeAware tool. It's free for all of them to add their data.
Nice, cool. And I mean, LiveEO started off doing infrastructure, as you mentioned, power lines, railways. Now you're doing as well EUDR.
Mm-hmm.
Looking ahead, where do you see the greatest potential for satellite-based technologies to improve not just supply chains, but sustainability as a whole?
So I think that what we're doing right now is sort of that leap ahead of where satellite data has been influencing sustainability to date. Where we see it, we're seeing it with EUDR today, but there are a lot of other regulations that are coming that are going to want this specific type of data. There are sustainability certifications that I know will be created based on this type of data. The importance of making sure that your supply chain is truly sustainable, meaning the business owner understands, where their goods are coming from and that those are sustainable, that's going to start becoming more and more important globally, instead of it just being an ESG, sort of team
Yeah.
that sits outside of the core business and just calculates numbers.
Cool.
And our mission at LiveEO is really to leverage Earth observation to make life better on Earth for all mankind. So when we think about how we're solving problems with utilities, right, we're building solutions that we're not just monitoring whether trees are going to hit a power line, but we're also trying to understand what that fire risk would be. Right, I'm from California, as I mentioned before, and we had 80 people killed in one city, 85 killed in one city because a power line came down, sparked a fire, and it just went crazy. If you know that risk is there, and you learn about it through geospatial technology, then you can do something about it, right? You can take an action, and the energy companies can fix it.
Yeah.
Right. So all of this is, we see it as very consistent, whether it's helping to preserve rainforests or helping to, prevent, unnecessary death or unnecessary outages for our power customers, or unnecessary train incidents because of debris falling on the tracks. That's all consistent with what we're doing.
Nice. And we often hear about the risks involved, and we've talked about it as well, in non-compliance with regulations like EUDR, but what are the opportunities? How can companies use this as a competitive advantage as opposed to an obligation?
That's actually a really good one. So, imagine your coffee company A, and your biggest competitor is coffee company B, and they've got 50% of the market share. But if they have an inferior solution for data analysis for EUDR, they're gonna be stuck. Their supply chain is gonna freeze up, which opens up an opportunity for anybody that's using that data, using that accurate data, to actually make an impact and take market share from their competitors that aren't ready for it, right? That aren't moving fast enough.
Right.
And that's one thing that we see happening. The other part is, we kind of see that markets are going to be created for sustainable goods that aren't just like greenwashing sustainability, but actual, data-driven and evidence-driven sustainability or sustainable supply chains that we're not seeing broadly today. We've seen lots of pledges, but when you can verify that these goods came from this place and this place is compliant with with this legislation and other pieces of legislation, I think we're going to, as a society, end up in a much better spot, especially when it comes to choosing whether you're going to buy sustainable goods or not, and who you're going to be buying those goods from.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I mean, satellite monitoring is, currently focused on infrastructure and deforestation.
Yeah.
But do you see this technology playing a larger role in other environmental challenges like water management or biodiversity tracking?
Yeah. So not only that, but also in not disaster response, but also understanding what flood risk is for certain areas. Again, going back to the fire, what the wildfire risks are. I worked at Planet Labs for 3.5 years, and they operate the largest imagery Earth observation constellation in the history of the world. It's some 300 satellites that are launching 2 new constellations throughout this year and into the next. And the use cases that we saw there are the same use cases that we're considering, right? So whether it's monitoring the migration or migration of refugees, right? Where are they going? Where are they coming from? This is information you can see from space. Understanding what's happening with refugee camps and the size growing and contracting. You can use it to make sure that people aren't being bad actors, promising to do A but not actually doing it. With Earth observation and the broad availability today, you can monitor that. So, whether it's, geopolitical, whether it's refugee related, whether it's disaster, understanding disaster, mitigating disasters, preventing deforestation in ways that go beyond what EUDR does. Right? There's the federal police in Brazil, they use geospatial data to monitor deforestation as it's happening. Okay. So when they get an alert, and usually it's like illegal gold mining or clear cutting for cattle or clear cutting for a runway for drug trafficking. When the federal police see it, they don't just, write a report. They get in a helicopter. And there's videos of this on
Wow.
YouTube that you can go and see. But they'll get in a helicopter, suited up, commando style, fly out there, arrest as many people as they can that are on site, and then destroy the equipment that was being used for deforestation. And this
Wow.
equipment's very expensive, right? Like some of those pieces are millions of dollars, but they destroy them on the ground and really try to take the initiative to stop the deforestation before it becomes too bad and too broad.
Amazing.
But these are, there are so many opportunities to do things like this with that type of data. It's, the number of use cases we can go after are almost limitless, which is why we kind of have to do a lot of homework. And we have a biz dev team that is out there and looking and seeing what might be next.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to do the legwork and the research before we make a commitment, because we can't do 1,000 things.
Sure.
But maybe we can do 3 things really, really well that, in the end, leave a positive impact on the planet as a whole and mankind as a whole. And when we decide to do that 4th thing, we want it to have that same level of impact.
Sure. And for companies that are just starting to explore satellite-based monitoring, where would you begin, particularly in the context of sustainability and compliance?
Yeah, so it all goes back to pain, right? What is the problem? How is sustainability, or how is being a sustainable company affecting your business? And again, EUDR was a great example of that. But there are other regulations that are going to come that may have a similar impact. If we can understand what the problem is they're trying to solve, and if we know that problem can be solved by looking at historical data versus current data, right, doing some change detection, that's a down the middle use case. Another very important use case is if you are actually purchasing land
Mm-hmm.
for conservation, for the purposes of conservation. If someone goes in and illegally logs it, then what was the point? But if you can monitor that land and you understand that the stands are still there, right, and that illegal deforestation isn't happening on those conservation easements, that's another great use case, but also means that when you spend the money, you're getting the value from it, or we're all getting the value from it in the end.
Sure. Okay, left field question, John.
Mm-hmm.
If you could have any celebrity or fictional character, alive or dead, as a spokesman for LiveEO and satellite tracking, who would it be and why?
It would be my great uncle.
Okay.
So my great uncle was an inventor of some note. You have no idea who he is, but he grew up on a farm, self-made, went to Antioch College in Ohio, then went to the Ohio State University for a master's and PhD. At various points, he was the director of development at Technicolor. He was the director of development at Kodak.
Wow.
He invented like the solar pool cover, those blue ones with the bubbles on that. But in his later years, he and his wife really started to focus on conservation, and they spent a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of capital, dollars as well as political capital, to try to preserve land in Los Angeles. And if you can imagine trying to preserve land in Los Angeles, it is a really tough thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But he and his wife did that. And actually, if you go, his name was Roy Deering, and his wife's name was Betty Deering. And if you go up into the Hollywood Hills off Laurel Canyon, there's a trailhead for a trail called the Betty Deering Trail that was named after her for her efforts to conserve that land, so it wasn't, didn't turn into houses. I like to think that, if he's looking down on me right now, he can see that what we're doing is an extension of that, right? I got my thirst for innovation from him.
Right.
And, I'm taking that and applying it to a problem that I think he really would have appreciated. And so, he may not be the best spokesman. Most people don't know him, but in Hollywood, he was known. Right? Wow. He was on the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. The sound you hear in theaters today is sound that he worked on, back in the day, and voted on that until the day he passed away. So, but I would really love for him to know that this is the product of the work that he did.
Fantastic. Wow, brilliant. John, we're coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question I did not ask that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't covered that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I think we covered a lot of what it is that we're doing, and where TradeAware sits in terms of being focused on business value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And solving the business problem of sustainability, not simply the paperwork and the tracking issue, which is not, that is important, right?
Sure. Yeah,
There are
yeah.
lots of companies that are going to solve that problem, but what we're trying to make sure the industry understands is that the problem is bigger than that. The issues are meaningful to the companies that have to comply with that regulation. And if we keep putting on blinders and thinking that the open source data is going to be the solution, we're not going to get anywhere with this.
Yeah. Okay, super. John, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Let's see. To learn about the company, LiveEO, it's live-eo.com is our web address.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to learn about me, go on LinkedIn. It's John Atkinson on LinkedIn.
Superb. John, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
All right. Thanks, Tom.